Welcome to the first of our panel series. This one is Ethics in Documentary Filmmaking. It should be very exciting. A little bit of house cleaning before we get started. I'd just like to thank our festival partners, major partners, Telefilm Canada, ACOA, the Government of Nova Scotia, the City of Halifax, and a special thanks to Cineplex for the use of the theaters. Without them, we would not be here. And also our sponsors, the RBC Emerging Artists, and Warner Brothers Discovery Access Canada. And I'm really looking forward to this. There's two more, one tomorrow at the same time. That's difficult subject matter, that's right, and difficult to remember. And, and on Wednesday, comedy series, same room, same place, same host, who I'm going to pass it off to now, Steph Joline.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for coming. This is so exciting. We have a really great group of filmmakers here, so it's going to be a really cool conversation. So yes, I'm Stephanie Joline. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a filmmaker. I live here in what's known today as Halifax, Nova Scotia. I do want to say we're on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I am an Indigenous person myself, but I am not Mi'kmaq, so I want to acknowledge that and thank the Mi'kmaq people for allowing us to be here today, and that I honor and respect the ongoing relationship between nations. Today's panel, as mentioned, subjects matter, ethics in documentary, and we have three really wonderful documentary filmmakers here today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get you each to introduce yourselves, mention the film that's playing here at this festival, maybe a little bit about it. Brett, can we start with you?
This is a lot of unexpected pressure. But I've done it before, so I'll try again. Gue daleach daloisi Brett Hannam tleawi gespukwit ulnoegdi duahan na daloisit MAWITAI'KW. I probably said that wrong. For people that watch this in the future, I apologize. My name is Brett Hannam. I'm from Gespukwit district of Mi'kmaq territory, what is now called Nova Scotia, and my film story is called MAWITAI'KW, and it is my first documentary, so I don't know if that qualifies me as a documentary filmmaker.
Yep, it does.
Okay. I was hoping to escape at that moment, but and it was made over 2 years with collaboration from the community, a lot of self-taping and gathering of footage with elders and knowledge keepers and people in far remote corners of Wamadagi territory, which extends across the Atlantic provinces, up into part of Quebec and down into part of Maine. So it's a lot of area to cover. But thankfully, the internet, it's everywhere. So it took 2 years to gather the material, to edit the material, to bring it back to community members, to talk about the material, to re-edit, and then here we are. And it played on the 16th. But it's online, too. Thanks.
So if you didn't see it, you can still catch it online through the festival.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brett. That was great. Jackie, tell us about the film that you have playing this festival.
My name's Jackie Torrens. My pronouns are she, they. My film is Bernie Langille Wants to Know What Happened to Bernie Langille. It was the Friday night Atlantic Gala presentation. You could have watched it up until yesterday, but nuts to you now. It is about a grandson who's trying to find out what happened to his grandfather, who died 50 years ago under very mysterious circumstances. He was named after his grandfather. He never met his grandfather, who was a corporal on the base of CFB Gagetown, and who went out one night, and then his wife woke up in the middle of the night with her husband in bed beside her with his head bashed in. And he was still alive at that point, but a series of events unfolded after that. And so it's about the grandson, Bernie Langille, trying to find out anything he can about what happened to his grandfather. And along the way, he learns more about the effects it had on 3 generations of his family, including himself. Is that a good roundup? That's a good roundup. Oh, it took 10 years to make. I wanted to beat Brett there for the 2-year thing. From concept to, the concept came 10 years ago. We found the story 5 years ago. We did a proof of concept short film first. We then got everything together to start filming the feature, and then a global pandemic hit, you might have heard. And anyway, and then it got done finally.
Great, thank you.
Thank
Go
you. Thank you for having me here. My name is Prajwala Dixit, and my film is called Love, AMMA. It's a letter to my daughter, who's right there in the audience. She's 6. And it speaks about our family's journey from diagnosis to acceptance, or the path to acceptance after we found out, after I was diagnosed with a mental illness, specifically borderline personality disorder, also now known as emotionally unstable personality disorder. I don't know who'd go out there and say I have an emotionally unstable personality disorder. Nobody would touch me with a 10-foot long pole. But here we are. That's my film. It's produced by Annette Clark and, of course, the National Film Board of Canada. It's my first with the NFB, Quebec Atlantic Studios, and my third short overall. Yesterday was the world premiere. I'd never sat and experienced my film with an audience, so so grateful to Finn for making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to dive in with the first question here. So I want to talk about the expectations that people have. So the people that you have on camera in your films. Jackie, maybe we can start with you. So in your case, it's, well, Bernie Langille is on screen, but the Langille family are involved in the, you know, they're on screen as part of the story. So can you tell me a little bit about, like, how upfront do you have to be with them before making the project about what they might expect to say or see through the development of the film?
Well, that's an ongoing process. I mean, the first Langille I met was Bernie Langille. So, you know, when we began, we weren't even sure if other members of the Langille family would take part in the documentary. And early on, you know, I heard from a couple of members of the Langille family who were essentially like, I'm not taking part, but you better get it right.
No pressure.
No pressure. And getting it right means different things to different people. It's interesting making a documentary because I'm always very upfront with, this is who I am. Also, here's my previous work. Please look at this work so you can tell how I tell a story. And I usually, you know, documentary's interesting. You want to go in with a plan. You usually have some idea about what you think this film is about, the destination you're headed towards. But then it is documentary and it's real life, and things can change along the way, and things can emerge, and all of a sudden the film is going down a different path than you ever expected it to. So what Bernie Langille wanted when we first started was he wanted to get a series of questions he had about what happened to his grandfather answered. So we began with those initial questions, and we had a research team, and we did a call to the public for help, and we started working on those questions. Along the way, other members of the Langille family decided that they did want to take part, which was great and exceptionally important. 2 sons of Corporal Langille decided to take part, and they really are the heart of the film. I can't even imagine the film without them, because for Bernie, what had happened to this grandfather he had never met, it was kind of, you know, especially when we started, it was theory. For his uncles, this was a devastating event that had actually happened to them when they were little children. So when they decided to appear on camera, it was funny, like, you know, one of the uncles especially, he had tried to go after the Canadian government in the 80s and the 90s to get some sort of financial payment that would basically be some indication from the government that they had some responsibility for what had happened to their loved one. The family believed it was a military cover-up. Whether it was or not, the military was certainly responsible for a number of astonishing events that had happened to their loved one. And there was only two short-lived investigations, boards of inquiry, and they were done by the military for the military, and the military ended up finding itself not responsible. So it was very important. The family had told the story for a long time, and they weren't believed, and not being believed was a huge source of, there's many sources of pain for the LANGILLE family, but that was certainly one of them, not being believed. And this kind of failed attempt in the 80s to get the government to, basically hold them financially responsible in a way, when that failed, that was really devastating to the family. So some of the LANGILLE families, members, really were hoping that this documentary would be a legal cudgel that they could use to try going again after the Canadian government. And so we actually shot segments that don't appear in the film because, you shoot a lot of things and not everything you shoot is going to end up in the film. And there are various reasons for that. Sometimes you can just have technical issues of why footage doesn't end up in a film. In any event, some of the stuff that we shot that dealt with more of the legal side of the story did not end up in the film. And so, even LANGILLE members who weren't in the film started pressuring LANGILLEs who were in the film to make sure that, that essentially the film could be used legally. And I had to keep saying, I said from the very start, like I completely empathize with why you would want a film to be used that way. But that's not why I'm making this film. And if in the end this film can be used in a way that might assist you, that's great. But that's not where I started. That's not where Bernie started when we started this together. Our first agenda was pretty simple, to find out whatever we could, to take Bernie's questions and to find out the answers for that. So you can say to somebody, here's who I am, here's how I tell a story, here are my intentions, and you can say that over and over again, and you should, because your relationship with your documentary participants is a constantly evolving relationship. But people are people, and they can still sometimes hear something and not hear it, and still hope that something's going to be included that's not. And so I think there are some LANGILLE family members that are still coming to terms with that, and other LANGILLE family members that completely accepted that. And even Bernie himself, who I think, because of the pressure he was feeling from some of the members of his family, was really starting to hope that maybe the doc could have that effect. Even now, he actually says now, which was gratifying for me, that he thinks what the film became in the end is more important, more valuable to him and his family.
That's really nice. That must be really amazing to hear that.
It was a huge relief.
So how long had you been shooting, actively in production, before you knew that some of these family members were going to participate?
Well, like I said, it was a long process. I met Bernie LANGILLE in 2016. We filmed a short film as kind of a proof of concept because we used miniatures for the reenactments. And to kind of sell that idea, we did a short film first. So only Bernie LANGILLE appeared in the short film. Then in 2018, we were commissioned to make it a feature. We then spent the year getting financing. We then start shooting in 2020. So it was pretty close to when we started shooting that we heard that. By that point, we had been making relationships with two of Bernie's uncles, and they wanted to participate. It was even less at that point about me asking them and them just knowing what was going on and on their own feeling that it would be really important to be part of this. For their own reasons of wanting to get the story out, finally being believed, but also then to help their nephew, Bernie.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that, Jackie. Prajwala, I'm going to move it over to you. So a lot of your family are in your film as well. You mentioned your daughter, but also you have other relatives and loved ones. What do you want to share with us? How you prepared them, how you asked them to be involved in this project?
Sure. This was the first time I was turning the camera onto myself and my family. My grandmother, to a certain extent, has an experience, quote unquote, performing to the camera because she is a trained classical South Indian musician. She's a vocalist. So she has been teaching, she's taught for 60 odd years and is in her 80s now. My little one was very enthused by the whole thing. So that wasn't, those two, the oldest and the youngest were easy to sort of convince. My mother is someone who's a reserved individual and likes to keep her life to herself. She never said she didn't want to participate, but was definitely not completely at ease to have a camera come into her house, or she got so fed up with me by the end of it because I was following her around with a camera myself, and she's like, "Why do you need me to? Why are you capturing me? Hanging clothes to dry. Why are you capturing me cutting onions?" But that's what I needed. I needed to make it feel like you're there, literally there in our home and our space when you watch the film. That's what I wanted to go for. South Asian families, like many families across the world, are, I shouldn't generalize, but if I were to speak about culture, ours is more a closed culture in the sense that there's not always dialogue between generations. And that is what I was trying to break in the film as well. And my grandmother and my mother had never had such questions put forward to them. And that was the first time I was able to ask my mother a lot of questions that I'd never had answers to myself. What you see is a sliver, and bringing it down to 15 minutes. 14 minutes and 58 seconds, not even 15 minutes, was a task. And what to keep, how to shape the story and each one's arc. And the arcs of the places involved, which is Bengaluru in India and St. John's in Canada, was... I couldn't have done it without my editor's support, obviously. But in answering your question, only for my mother, she asked me, to make her feel comfortable, I said, these are the kinds of questions I'm going to talk about. I have not done that previously in other documentaries that I have worked on, but for my mother, I did offer this. Nothing. She didn't ask me to remove anything, but just to give her a sense of. She was very, very nervous. So to sort of comfort her and say that yes, this is a challenging situation we're opening ourselves to. At the same time, I'm still your daughter, and film or no film, I'm still your daughter. So that's something. That was the process for this film with each of my family members, my subjects. So yeah.
Bring it back to the title of the panel there. Love it. There was a really powerful scene of you and your mother in the kitchen. It was quite uncomfortable to watch as a viewer. So I really respect that because I was like, that must not have been an easy conversation to have.
No, yeah, that was an hour and a half, and there were a lot of things that were spoken and said, and then to understand why. So with I'm sure, I mean, there's so many renowned filmmakers here, but I go back to three questions: why am I making this? Why am I to tell this story, and why am I using this medium? So those are my three questions that I keep going back to the drawing board. I like to use a visual metaphor that guides me in every decision that touches the film, right from pre-production to including the poster. I want it to resonate with the visual metaphor that I carried. And for this particular film, Love, AMMA, it was also under the Reimagining the Island's call. So for me, I was trying to reimagine the island and ask myself the question, what is an island without the ocean around it, without the waves around it shaping it? What am I without my disorder? Who am I without it? Am I something? Am I not something? What am I? So that became the waves, and the island became the guiding force to shape the film.
Beautiful, thank you. Brett, I'm gonna come over to you now. I wanted to ask you about, do you know, so are some of the people in your documentary friends, acquaintances, strangers, a little bit of everything?
A little bit of everything. Originally, the idea was to travel very widely to different communities and do these interviews in person, but that became impossible for obvious reasons. So instead, we relied on people sending in like self-tapes a lot of the time, or like over Zoom. And it's always a fun experience to ask a group of people to like film themselves. Maybe they have never recorded themselves before. And I gave questions. There was like 10 questions that we had come up with, working with the Wabanagi Two-Spirit Alliance. And the questions weren't like strict questions. They must all be answered. It was more to the comfort of the participants, what they wanted. It was their space. They could say anything. They could just tell a story if they wanted. So we left it very open to how people engage and express themselves, and got it back with that intention, a bunch of very different material. So, you know, any expectations there, were just, you know, I was like, I'll let them form as the material comes. So for those segments, like the more interview type segments, that was how most of them ended up. And, you know, some of them I'm acquainted with, and some others I've never met before. Because some came from Newfoundland or New Brunswick or different places. And then we moved into a different stage of pandemic where it's like we can kind of gather a little bit, but, you know, safely with protocols and so on. So then that was a little more on the ground, but then we're filming people, mostly they have masks on, but then in some situations they were able to take the masks off and share teachings and knowledge and language and culture. So we were super lucky to be able to kind of take advantage of the change of the pandemic, I guess, and come together to gather in person. And that kind of became the focus of the doc, was for Two-Spirit people coming together and gathering and finding support kind of in our own communities and together. Like, what does that look like in person? And then when you cannot gather, what do you do? Like, what activities do you engage in? So the people that I was filming more like on the ground, like during medicine walks, or that were teaching or sharing knowledge, those people I know, some of them very well, some of them are elders and or cultural carriers. So there's varying degrees of like, don't know, kind of know really well, don't really know. And so it's a very odd experience, especially since this is my first kind of documentary. I was like, maybe this is how it's supposed to be. I don't know.
So were you more nervous, or did you feel more pressure for the people that you knew or didn't know?
There wasn't really much pressure with the people I knew. It was more the responsibility of making sure that the language is handled properly and the culture is transmitted in a good and respectful way. And then for the people that I didn't know, because they're sending in self-tapes, I'm like, what I get is what I get. And sometimes it's like, oh, this person just they know what they're doing. They're filming themselves. The audio is great, and the questions are, they're answering their own questions, or they're just speaking from their heart, and it's clear. And then other times it's, okay, I can understand what is going on, but maybe we have to tweak some things, or I can't adjust frame. So, again, different degrees.
But they all knew obviously what the project was and what they were getting into, and they all wanted to be involved in the project. So hopefully it was a positive experience for them
Yes,
all,
yeah.
because they were sending in their sort of self-tapes. Jackie, I'm going to go to you with another question over here. So in your film, Bernie is really on his journey. He's would you say he's the host? He's not really the host of the doc, but he's kind of the main
I call him the
character.
protagonist. He's the protagonist
Okay,
of the
yeah.
doc.
And he's even like finding out stuff about, he's speaking to people, finding out more information about his own family, history and trauma and related to that. So can you tell me a bit about how you prepared Bernie to go on that journey? Did you? Yeah, like
for sure.
emotionally or
Yeah.
mentally prepared him?
So, Bernie and I talked about when we were starting this of like, what is it you want to know? And so we started with that, the questions that Bernie himself had. And so whoever we would go see, he would then conduct that interview because he had the question. And we would basically say, your question to this. Like one of his questions was, a pool of blood was found at the bottom of the basement stairs, and the family didn't know if he was pushed down the stairs or if he fell down the stairs. They didn't know how he got up the stairs into the bedroom. And Bernie and his family thought for a long time he must have been pushed down the stairs, because when Bernie found, one of the first documents that Bernie found on his own was the medical examiner's report, and there was nothing in the medical examiner's report that talked about bruises to the forearms or elbows, and he thought, if you're conscious and you're falling down the stairs, you're going to throw your arms out. Even if you're inebriated, you will throw your arms out. Well, we took him to a biomechanics expert who had that answer. And so what we would say to him beforehand is, this is the guy that's going to give you the answer to this question. And then sometimes during the interviews, he could ask whatever he wanted, and sometimes I would ask him, can you also ask this? But in the end, it was up to Bernie what he was going to ask. So that's how we prepared him for whenever we were taking him to see someone who had a specific question that he had had. What was more complicated was, there was things like had been a military doctor who had assaulted his grandfather when his grandfather was critically ill, and he really wanted to know who this guy was and what had happened to him. It was really difficult to find out who that guy was and what had happened to him. But Tara Doyle, who was our researcher for the project, ended up finding out this kind of bizarre second act story to this military doctor. This case, and she found a series of newspaper articles spanning over a couple of years across the country. We also would get things like handwritten letters, either written from his grandmother to somebody. Someone would give us that, and it would have additional information that we hadn't even necessarily been seeking. So I was puzzled as to, how do I deliver this information to Bernie? Bernie gave us his blessing to go get this information. For Bernie himself to get the information we got, he would have had to quit his job and full-time devote himself to trying to find out these answers. But when it came to information that was like in articles and letters, it was like, how do I deliver this information to him? So I came up with this concept that's in the film, where essentially I called it Mail from the Past. And I had the artist who created miniature make a set where it was essentially a tiny mailbox on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. And you go to that in the film every time. There's essentially a series of documents that Bernie is going to open to get the information about. And so that was more difficult because essentially I would say, okay, we're going to have a studio day, and I'm going to give you a series of, we're going to go through different sections, and they're going to deal with this. But you're not going to know what's in the envelope. So sometimes it was tricky going, because you don't want to do any harm, and you have to and need to care about your documentary participants. One of the things that we did was we got this guy, Dr. John Whalen, who's a psychologist and an author. He was a former military veteran himself, and he specializes in working with military families. And so Dr. Whalen met with Bernie. We met with Dr. Whalen beforehand to talk about, this is who Bernie is, this is the story, how can you help us prepare him? And then in the film, he has 2 sessions with Bernie, and one is near the film where he's essentially preparing Bernie emotionally for what he may find. He says at one point, are you prepared for what you may find? Are you prepared for other family members? You may find some stuff out that they don't want to hear. And he talked about family stories and how they have a significant impact on our identity, and that people, even when you introduce new truth, may be resistant to that because they have been going with a story, and that story is the story they know, and we kind of change is hard. And then we had Dr. Whalen meet with Bernie at the end of the film after we had kind of gone on this journey. And there was difficult information along the way. There was information that we had not expected to find at all that just came out through our search and our call to the public. So Dr. Whalen met with Bernie again at the end of it to help him start processing that information and what to do about it. And we were really thankful for Dr. Whalen's participant because we wanted to take care of him. So
It almost looked like that was a conversation that could have been had off camera. Almost. Like, it seems like it was something that he might had wanted to, or you would have had asked him if he wanted to have a psychologist speak.
I felt
and
it was
talk him
important
through
to
it.
have it on the camera because I thought also the audience, the film is about, ultimately, it's about family stories and their effect on us and intergenerational trauma. And the response has kind of been amazing. Like, people have taken it that way, and they, of course, start talking about their own family stories and their own cycles of intergenerational trauma. So I actually thought the advice that Bernie was getting from Dr. Whalen was important for the audience as well to see. And I also kind of, in a way, I wanted, it's a way for the viewer to know as well that the filmmakers are taking care of our subject. And that seemed important too.
Yeah, that is very important. I think that's kind of what I thought it was there for, but I never thought about that you just mentioned. Also, the viewer can actually take this advice. Yeah, that was great. Prajwala, I want to ask you a question about how personal your film is. And did you hesitate to make it?
Yes, it's very personal. It's yes and no. When I was diagnosed, it was the height of the pandemic. We'd just come off the lockdown. And the reason the diagnosis finally happened is because I attempted to take my life. And in the course of that whole year, even through making of this film, and it happens, it just comes, like I said in the film, it's just like the waves, it's always present. And you just learn to navigate and work through that. But it's a total of, I'd say, over 10 attempts within a year, and during the making of this film. So the hesitation was more so, can I do this? Do I have it in me to do this? The hesitation was responsibility towards my family, and it is legacy in a different kind, and inheritance of a different kind for my daughter, and hers to follow. So is that something I want to pass down as legacy in such a public manner? So those were the hesitations. At the same time, as I don't even know how many minutes have passed, but the stats go, according to World Health Organization, every 40 seconds a person dies of suicide, and I think there's 20 more attempts to every success. So as we've spoken, there's several people across the world who've just lost their lives to this, and I knew who I am very well, what I am and what I am capable of as a human being. I knew my family knew that. And at the same time, there were changes when I came out publicly about my mental illness. And I could see a shift in how people perceived me. So it became very imperative to put forth a narrative that shows that a mentally ill person can live a mentally healthy life. Mental illness does not mean you're mentally unhealthy. Those are two separate things. And what I mean by that is, if you have diabetes, if you have a heart condition, if you have any other physical ailment, IBS, you can take the help and support required to lead a very healthy, quote-unquote, normal. The word normal really irks me, like who is normal? What is normal? But that's what I was trying to put forth here. Through my therapy sessions, I found out that many people with borderline personality disorder aren't parents. Most of them aren't mothers because sustaining interpersonal relationships is so difficult. And it became, then that layer added on that I am a mother and how lucky am I to be a mother and to also live with borderline personality disorder. Yeah, so the hesitations were there. At the same time, the motivation was there. And it wouldn't have happened without the support of my family, as well as the team at the National Film Board of Canada. Those two sort of catalyzed the whole process, if you may. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it answers it beautifully. I'm very saddened and sorry to hear about your struggles, but I also thank you very much for sharing your story with us, because it's certainly an important one, and the film is beautiful. And this word gets thrown around a lot, but I do think it's very brave that you did that and made that film, and I hope you're very proud of it. I would like to ask you another question, though. Also, you seem like you have a lot of patience. You're speaking to family members that may not have believed at some point that you have mental health issues. Do you have advice for anybody who might be, maybe their friends or family haven't really fully accepted yet who they are?
Sure. First off, I just want to put it out there that what you see is a sliver of time in my family's journey on the path to acceptance. This was what happened right after we found out this is what I have been diagnosed with. I then, later on, while, because the shoot was scheduled a part in India and then a part in Canada, once I returned to Canada and I then did a Zoom interview with my parents. And in that interview, it was 9 months after the interview you watch in the film with my mother. That didn't make it to the film because it didn't look pretty. So one of those things where a Zoom call didn't really look pretty and really spoil the aesthetic of the film. But I've mentioned it in so many different places. My mother very succinctly explained why she had the reaction she had. And her journey in coming to terms was coming from a place of pure motherly love. And what she meant by that is, I believe that day at my child's school, an incident had happened, a very minor one. And I was telling her about it, and I was a little upset because the teacher had said something about my child, something really small. And my mother instantaneously said that, you've been with your child for 6 years, and that teacher has been with your child for, a few months, and she's mentioned one thing, and you found it hard to digest, right? I said, yes. I've been with you, I've been a mother for 30-odd years, and suddenly someone in some island in Canada decides that my child is mentally ill, and then goes on to say it's because of things that happened in her childhood. That was really hard for me to grasp and come to terms with. So she's speaking from that space. But of course, add to that the layers of culture and the fact that it is still taboo. It's such a heavy, it's saying that I am mentally ill took me a huge journey. I'm comfortable saying it now in public, but when I was first diagnosed, I was very much in the closet, and I didn't want to share it with anyone except a few loved ones. So to answer your question, every member of your family will go through their own journey on the path to acceptance. I remember one thing, and that is I was in St. John's, downtown St. John's, and a man walked up to me and asked me, do you have a loonie to spare? I lost everything to mental illness, my job, my family, my friends, my community. It's a arduous journey and path to be on, but I remember this man's words always, because it could happen to any of us. And when it happens to one of us, if we look at it in a collective fashion and understand that it happens to all of us, I think then our social systems, our healthcare systems, our familial systems all then would sort of support the healing and nurturing and growth required when you're going through such difficult times in your life.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was beautifully said. This is kind of a question for everybody, but maybe Brett, I'll start with you. When you're telling a story based on other people's experiences, how do you decide what to cut out of the film, what you should be keeping in the film? How hard are those decisions to make?
That's a tough one.
You want me to skip you and come
no,
back to you?
I mean, it'd still be tough when you come back. It's hard because, especially in our case, because we had kind of started out thinking that we were doing something different a little bit, and then kind of it became more about focusing on like the impact of the pandemic on the Two-Spirit community in Wabanagi territory. So we had to, rethink things. But then that made it easier in a way because that's what the core of it is about. So the interviews that were self-taped and sent in, I tried to not touch them as much as possible. I had to edit a little bit because of time considerations and constraints, but it was important to make sure that people's voices are heard as intact as possible. And that was a conversation that kind of continued on with the Two-Spirit Alliance as we began to edit the footage together. There was a lot that didn't make it in, and it was all like equally important stuff. So it was very hard. I think up until the last round of editing, it was like I have like 28 or 29 minutes of stuff, and I'm like, some of it has to come out.
Did you have a time that you were aiming for like a delivery to somebody specifically?
No, it was not really. It was more kind of like the goal was around 15 minutes. Well, the goal was 10 minutes, I think. And then, I let myself go to 15, and now it's like 17 minutes. So that's how it happens. But just because in order to like observe the flow of the story, that is kind of unearthed as you edit. That was part of what was helping dictate when things come in or go out, when we're hearing certain things. And I have a lot of footage. Like, we had gathered in, for the first time since the pandemic, in 2020, during Pride, there was a Two-Spirit teepee that was put up, and we were able to share. Some people were able to gather in a limited capacity, and there were elders and knowledge keepers there, so we just like filmed everything. There's so much stuff. But then watching all the footage and listening to the words, there were some things that came out that were more relevant or directly referencing what was going on now. I think at one point, one of our knowledge keepers, Duma Young, was speaking about the impact of colonization on the population, on the Mi'kmaq population here, and saying this is about how many people there were when we started. I can't remember the numbers, I'm sorry. Numbers and me are not friends. A lot. There was a lot of people here. And then when people came, when settlers came, there were a lot of deaths from germs, germ warfare, these blankets and all these other things. And so the population was greatly reduced, significantly reduced, like to an insane level, dropped, and then has slowly been growing ever since. But that, talking about how pandemics and illnesses and diseases impact populations, that seemed relevant.
Pretty relevant.
Yeah, so I was like, okay, instantly in, I don't have to think about that one much. Other things were like more asking guidance about like, do you think this fits? Or talking to John, our syllaboy at the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance, and saying, this is kind of what I want to do. And then getting feedback of like, actually, no, we shouldn't touch that. Or we should not edit this. Or it looks prettier if you do edit it, but let's not. And that was kind of, we leaned into that aesthetic as well. It's like self-tape, grassroots, you know, close to the ground. Oh, the heart is there, but it's not like a boom crane swinging in anywhere. But it was all just, most of it came out of that collaborative process and the editing and finding the story like that.
So you really have more experience in the scripted narrative world. You're a very successful filmmaker in the scripted narrative world, if I may say so. So did you find it harder? So when you're editing in the edit room a feature film that you wrote, where actors are portrayed, you can cut out lines. I imagine it would be easier. Is it easier to go like, this is all my stuff, I can cut out whatever I want? But then when you have real people on screen like speaking from their heart, is it like more pressure? Like, ooh, I don't know if I want to cut their words. Those aren't my words.
Yeah, there is more pressure in that way that you're describing, because I'm like, I just want to drop these interviews in, and they should be heard as fully as possible. I don't have the right to touch them, and actually I have a responsibility to make sure that they are cared for and portrayed properly, and I hope everyone feels like that, because it just played. We haven't shared it a lot, so everything's good so far. But there is that pressure for sure, and that's something that's new to me, and created a conundrum.
So wait, so you've showed it, you played it once. Have you had any feedback yet of any of the people that were involved in the film? Did they get to see it yet? Or did you send them maybe?
Yeah, people have seen it. There hasn't been really much feedback. It's been kind of like, cool.
Good. Okay.
But eventually, I'm sure there'll be more feedback as they rewatch and watch it with other people. That thing about watching movies with different people and how, it changes or something.
I guess I didn't go down the line with this question, but so what I was going to also add to that was if anyone had any examples of when you showed your film to someone, do you have any examples of people not really reacting super kindly with it? I mean, Jackie, you kind of said that some members of the LANGILLE family maybe are still realizing what could or couldn't be done. Do you have anything to speak about there? Or also sorry, I'm now throwing two questions out. Also in the world of what to cut out or what to leave in?
Well, that's a really interesting question. My first thing in terms of what to keep in, what to cut out is it interesting? So that's my number one question. Part of the reason we cut a lot of the legal stuff out was because it just actually wasn't compelling to watch or hear. Compelling to the LANGILLE family, very important to them personally, but not in terms of the story. Also, does it relate to your themes? And your main theme is another question that way. And then, we also received some really difficult information that we weren't expecting about Corporal LANGILLE himself. And we had to be sure the motivations of the person who was sharing that information. That person also had historical documentation to back that information up. And then that information was confirmed by a member of the Langille family in front of Bernie Langille, and didn't want that information going on camera. So I respected that, but I included the difficult information because in terms of, it related so much to my main character's journey and revelation about finding out about how much this event had affected him. That difficult information to me was like a huge light bulb of like, oh, this family hasn't just been tied to the unresolved and unjust death of a loved one. This family is tied to the unresolved and unjust death of a complicated loved one. And that information was imperative to Bernie's journey and imperative to the film. So, I wanted to leave it in, and it had to be left in, but I also honored that other family members' wishes and did not did not include the footage where they were offering additional information on that.
And when in the moment, did they say, please don't film this? Or was it later on they
Yeah,
said, please
no,
cut
they
that
said
out?
in the moment they said, well, actually they didn't say cut filming. They just said, I don't want this on camera. Then they kept filming with us and they reiterated their trust in me. Along the way, I actually went out to the Langilles that had taken part in this, including Bernie Langille, before the film, before they ever saw the film. I went out and prepared them for it. I said, I want you to know, this is what's included in the film. And I mentioned that the difficult information was also included in the film, that the part of information that the family member didn't want me to include was not included in the film. And I said to all of them, like, it's going to be really odd for you to see this the very first time, and it's probably going to be very difficult the very first time. And I want you to know that I am here, and if you want to contact me and talk about it, I am here for you. And if you don't want to talk to me about it, I will take your lead and I will respect that. But it is going to get easier for you each time you watch it, but there will be processing that you will need to do, and that's exactly what has happened. And now, just like you were speaking earlier, some people are further along on that journey of processing and accepting, and then have gone from initial resistance to, I'm really glad that the film is the way it is.
Were you, or any of you, nervous showing it for the first time, especially to some of the people that are on camera?
I haven't done this before, right? This was the first time I was turning the camera on myself and my family. So the process was different than the other two shorts that I'd worked on. And in this particular one, which is Love AMMA, I did show the rough cuts to my family members. One rough cut and the fine cut, and then the final product. That's how it went. There were no notes provided or anything of that sort. None of that was asked for or provided. All that happened is that we all bawled and cried a lot. So that's how I knew that it was touching them. And that was my biggest note to take away. I think when we are an emotional family, as you can see in the film, but I like to see what it evokes in people. Emotions are such a universal language, and the visual medium is so powerful and can evoke so many things. What was difficult is we had such difficult conversations, and then to pick out what to keep and what to not keep was what was challenging, but we worked through that, and this was also the first time I included narration, which takes its own little bit of an editing process. So I began with words, then went to the visuals, then came back to the words again. So that's how the process unfolded.
Is it about 4 o'clock right now? Close to it? Okay.
All right.
So
Okay, thank you so much. It was a
we're going to have
pleasure.
to leave a little bit early.
you.
We're going to keep going with the panel for a little
Yes.
bit.
Thank
but,
you so
Prajwala
much.
has to
Pleasure
catch a
seeing
flight.
you all.
Thank you so
Take
much
care.
for
Thank you.
coming.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll take it. I'll turn it off. Yeah. Thank you for coming, and beautiful film.
Thank you, Stephanie.
And have a great, safe flight. Thank you. I don't. Can I give that new? So that means it's about almost 4 o'clock. I wonder if we should start taking questions. Does anyone here have a question? It doesn't have to be specifically about ethics. It could just be about filmmaking, documentary, anything at all. You don't have to be shy. Oh, right over here.
Thank you, everyone, for your work and for the support of insights. My question is about ethics when you're turning the camera, when you're the subject, and it's a difficult topic. It can be easy to think like, well, it's my story, I get to tell it whatever the hell I want. What kind of consideration, though, might you want to think about for your audience, like around like not being exploitative, or to your own or others' traumas, or just like being sensitive to how the audience might receive information, even if you're the one telling it?
Hmm.
Curious about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I'll just say it again for the camera, if the camera didn't pick up the audio. I think what you're asking is, even if you might be comfortable saying something, as Prajwala just left, but if you might be comfortable saying or sharing information on camera, does that mean everyone else is going to be comfortable hearing it? Am I sort of summing up your question right? Like, what are the kind of considerations you have to take and have in mind?
Is there a responsibility to an audience?
Is there a responsibility to an audience? Mm-hmm. Okay, no question. Do either of you have any thoughts on that one?
I would never put myself on camera.
Audience or no audience? You
Despite
just
the
don't wanna
camera
do it.
being right in front of me. It's just not something I would do. But it is an interesting question. I've never thought about that.
Okay, we could ask you that question even with narrative work too. Like, what you're comfortable saying, or what
Yeah,
responsibility do you have to an
I mean,
audience with the stories you're telling?
The responsibility to the audience, it's a little different, I think, with a narrative, but I do have that in mind about how people are experiencing things or the emotional journey that they're being taken on. I'm thinking more of the question in the terms or frames of if I'm drawing experiences from my own life and putting them into a story. I'm actually I'm more conscious of not being exploitative to myself and not mining my own traumas or very personal experiences to put in front of an audience just to entertain people. So there's a self-care aspect, at least from my perspective, that comes into a situation like that. I think what you're talking about is like the reverse or the opposite of that, kind of a little bit. Yeah, I just think it's a very interesting question. I'll probably be thinking about it for a couple of days now.
It's a very
You might have more
interesting question.
I don't know. It is a really difficult question. I have wrestled with it. I haven't put myself on camera in terms of a documentary form doing that, but I have had things that have happened in my life and my family life where if I talk about that, a member of my family was hurt in a series of sexual assaults that affected my family profoundly. I have really wanted to write about that and do a piece about that, and I'm struggling with how to do it because the assaults happened to my family member, not myself. And their right to privacy is their right to privacy. I remember I saw an interview one time with Frances McDormand, and she was talking about, when you got to see a film and, it's like the autobiographical story of, someone's written their autobiographical story. I did that in my first play, pretty standard, like, this is me. But one thing she said in that interview was, I prefer bold, not bald. And so when I am actually often, I also write narrative stuff. Often what I do is I alchemize it and I hide it in a different story. So I take the themes that I am struggling with and then I just kind of disguise it. So it's not overt, I guess. However, though, sometimes you want a more overt manner of being able to talk about something. And I guess then you kind of have to weigh who is involved and the potential harm done to them, which is not answering your question about the audience so much. To the audience, I think you owe authenticness that way. But yeah, that's a difficult question.
Did you say bold, not bald?
Bold, not bald.
What is that? I don't think I understand. What does that mean?
Tell a story in a way that is true and authentic and original, but don't do it so obviously, I guess. Like,
Oh, okay.
yeah, that's
Not
what I
bald.
took it to mean.
Okay. Cool.
It rings in my head a lot.
Tara Thorne.
Thank you. I've always thought actors make really great directors of fiction because you work on sets and you know how to tap into character work and things like that. Is there anything from your acting work, Jackie, that informs your work as a director in a format that you can't direct the performances? Like, I'm sure you're thinking of, oh, I know a better answer, or I've seen you say it better.
Let me take it.
Yeah. Like, is there anything from your other training that informs this work?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, I'm sure you agree too, like anybody in the arts on the East Coast, if you are going to survive, you usually do more than one thing. And if you can do more than one thing, it's actually a really lucky thing to do. And I work in scripted and unscripted, and I call them my 5 in practical careers. And all of those jobs inform one another. They give me energy and knowledge that I take back to every other job. And one of the biggest things about being an actor, besides the lesson as a writer of, when you're speaking great dialogue, you're learning as a writer. When you're speaking terrible dialogue, you're learning as a writer. But in terms of the world of documentary, it keeps me in touch with the vulnerability that comes from putting yourself before the camera. It's an exceedingly vulnerable thing. And whether you're an actor on a set dealing with a scripted project, or you're just a real life person who's found themselves, I'm a documentary participant, you're the only one where, in order to do your bit for that project, everyone else stops and looks at you. Like, if I'm doing any other job, I can just carry on doing my job and the world doesn't stop. But when you're the one before the camera, everybody stops and watches you do that thing that you're going to do. And so I think to always be having that experience of, because it's a scary, vulnerable thing. It really is. It takes a lot of bravery as an actor or just a regular person in front of the camera to be in front of the camera. So I'm always glad to have that experience that keeps me in touch with that, because then I think I can extend that empathy to my documentary participants. Oftentimes, too, if I can swing it, depending on how we're filming, I kind of like to have the camera going from the second we show up until we go, and to always have it rolling, just so that they are accustomed to, whenever I'm around, there's a camera around and it's rolling.
I'm going to piggyback off of Tara's question and ask Brett, because you don't have a background as an actor that I know of, but you do have a background as a really great writer. So when you're looking at other people in a documentary format saying things, are you ever thinking, oh, if I was writing this, it would be, they should, this line would be better than that line?
No, I don't actually, because of the way I work as a director on set, is that the script isn't precious. The dialogue isn't precious. It's a jumping off point of collaboration. So I'm more than willing to embrace what the actors bring and workshop it with them and figure out what feels natural. And oftentimes there's things that are way better than the stuff that I could write. So I'm a sham. It's all a lie. If you read my scripts, they're all very wooden. But because of that, when I am getting footage just from people that are speaking from their heart, that's kind of what I look for. If they're speaking from their heart, it's not wrong. It can't be wrong. Right. It's all good.
So you don't really want to write it a different way. You're
yeah.
not even thinking about that. Yeah.
No, I just kind of I'm like, awesome, I'm glad I got this. And then sometimes I'm like, I wish the framing was just a little bit up.
Right, yeah. That's the bad thing about self-tapes. Great. A question right here.
Yeah, Jackie and Brett, you both work in narrative and documentary, Brett, you mentioned this documentary. I'm curious, working in both of those formats, what do you find most challenging, and what do you find most gratifying? And Brett, for you, what has been most surprising, and what you've learned by working in these formats?
So working both in narrative and documentary. Maybe we can start with Brett. I think you said Brett at the end. We'll start with Brett. What's been the most surprising going from scripted narrative stuff to documentary stuff?
I guess in scripted narrative stuff, sometimes you have like a happy accident and you're like, wow. And then documentaries all happy accidents. And then you look for kind of like the commonality, or this is what I do. I don't know if it's how you're supposed to do it or if there is a way. I just look for like the commonality between like these moments of people that are sharing parts of themselves, and then trying to do my best to be true to that. It's kind of, it's also collaboration, but it's just kind of like a slightly different shape. So that was a bit of a surprise to recognize the similarities there, but to also find that like I can't do the thing, I can't like collaborate in the normal way that I would. It's more kind of like on the back end. But I was happy to find that it was still like, it's still all collaborative, like, and because I would like to work like that, and that's how I work.
Cool. Jackie, do you have any thoughts about because yes, you also have done scripted stuff and not
Yeah.
scripted.
I guess, you know, sometimes people are surprised that, like, when you write a documentary script, they're, what do you mean write a documentary? People kind of have an idea of, oh, you just go out with a camera and you collect, you know. Well, for Bernie, we shot 1,400 hours, right? So someone, me, has to take all that footage and whittle it down into 78 minutes. So, you know, nonfiction, there's fiction in nonfiction in terms of you are assembling a structure from real life that doesn't happen inherently to real life. And there's also nonfiction and fiction in terms of real human truth as well. The collaboration aspect is interesting because you are dealing with a real person. So again, it's kind of an ongoing negotiation and an ongoing evolution. And I got inspired by both, you know, like Bernie just took us 6 years to do, extended because of the pandemic. And I'm now going to write a scripted project because I want a rest from nonfiction. And I'm going to get that by going into fiction. And then I'm sure I'll leave fiction and go back to nonfiction. It certainly is a real, there's both, I think, ultimately, at the best of times, are benign dictatorships when you're the one writing and directing it. Hopefully it's a benign dictatorship. Because ultimately, someone has to call the shots, right? And so you want to be open for the gifts that other people kind of bring you. You want to go in with a plan. So even with documentary, where it's like you're dealing with real life and real people, you still have to have a plan. But you have to go in open enough so that there's room for wherever real life is going to take you when you are there with the camera. I don't know if that's answering that question in a really great way, but those, I guess, are some of my thoughts. And I get a lot of energy and inspiration from doing both. I'm glad I actually get to be scripted and non-scripted fluid. So.
Cool. Oh, hand right here, and then we'll go to you.
I think this has a lot to do with the whole idea of ethics in documentary. It's a question I have in the back of my mind a lot about what you're doing. It probably applies more to Jackie than just to Brett. But how do you deal with the potential of things like litigation coming up because of what you're doing? Is that a
Litigation.
consideration? Is that something that you have to go into things thinking, well, I better have a lawyer ready just in case? I think it's a
Good. Very
It's
legit
totally
question.
a legitimate question. And this piece in particular that I just finished had more of those questions than other pieces that I have done. When I'm working on something and finding stuff and setting stuff up, I don't tend to think of those things. It's after I've collected the footage and I start assembling that we then look at what it is I think we're going to have in this film, and then Jess starts to ask the legal questions, and then we run it by an entertainment lawyer. It was really frustrating in terms of we had found out a lot of stuff about this military doctor that had assaulted Corporal LANGILLE. Astonishing stuff, jaw-dropping stuff, and it was all there in a series of different articles. And Bernie, when he saw those articles, commented on, he had lots of comments about this man that had assaulted his grandfather. many of those comments we couldn't use because it might put us in legal kind of jeopardy. That
Even though it was just his opinion.
even though it was just his opinion.
Okay.
And so that was really frustrating because it at times felt like, but we're bottling Bernie out. This was a genuine reaction Bernie had to this man who actually did this proven thing to his grandfather. So.
Oh, that's
you know,
frustrating. Was that frustrating?
It
that
was
you
really
had to cut that out?
frustrating. Yeah. So then you just kind of do a bit of this dance with the lawyers. What can I keep? What can he say? If he's saying something else, slightly different version. Can we use this? And and depending on what the lawyers are saying, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't.
Quick follow-up. Relative to that exact incident, for example, and without having to give up the information that you don't want to give up, but was it a matter mostly of Bernie having a reaction and coming to conclusions that were perhaps conjecture on his part? That's why you couldn't include him in the film? I'm just curious as to why.
Right, because as if he just said, "Oh, this makes me mad,"
Yeah, I
then
mean,
that
if there's documentary
probably fine.
evidence, if there's something in writing that is part of the public record perhaps, or that had to be uncovered maybe to a certain extent, at that point, if it's public record, if it's common knowledge eventually, or Phil makes it more common knowledge, I guess, but is it simply because Bernie had a reaction that would cast aspersions on someone that would perhaps also implicate the person in something that isn't documented?
It was kind of like that. Essentially, this doctor had been found guilty twice in two separate incidences involving two separate people over the span of about 10 years. And in both times, he was then acquitted on technicalities. And so the fact that he was acquitted on technicalities, not found innocent, which is a different thing. Bernie being able to say things like, I think that guy was a bad doctor, is like, you can't actually say that because legally he was acquitted, though it was on a technicality. So it was that kind of stuff.
There's a question over here.
Yes, for both of the filmmakers, I'm wondering if you could share with us a couple of films over the last few years that you have found very influential and that perhaps have been a model for what you've done or what you hope to do in the future.
Great. Oh yes, I will repeat it for the camera. Films that you've seen that inspired you, maybe inspired you about these projects, or just otherwise, just inspiration in general.
For documentary-wise, I would say all of the films of Alanis Obomsawin, like amazing human being, amazing filmmaker. Work continues to inspire me. And for, actually I watched it the other day, narrative film, Moonlight. That's kind of like has stuck, it's stuck there. So I come back to that a fair amount and think about it. There's probably other stuff in there, but those came to the surface.
For me specifically, when I was working on Bernie Langille, a huge documentary influence for me is Errol Morris. I've loved him for a number of years. And he had come out, as I had been working on mine, it's on Netflix, actually, a documentary series where there's a lot of parallel themes. It's about the son of a CIA agent who mysteriously died, and the son for years has been trying to find out what happened. So even things like in my film, Bernie directly addresses the audience as looking right down the camera lens, and we use the Interrotron, the direct eye lens, which is something that Errol Morris developed way back. And I find it was great to finally use that. I actually really wanted a participant looking down the lens. So that was certainly an influence. There's a documentary that came out, I think in 2018, called 306 Hollywood, which is about a brother and sister processing the death of their grandmother, and they use some miniatures in it, and I love that film. I found it so beautiful. And then another big influence, which is not a film, but for Bernie Langille, that kind of started for me 10 years ago was the work of a socialite turned criminologist named Frances Glessner Lee. She was working in the States around the 1920s, and she wanted to go into criminology. She was a woman, and at that time they were like, why don't you go take up a hobby, lady? And among rich ladies at that time, it was popular to build tiny things. So she started building tiny things, but she started making real-life dioramas of gruesome real-life crime scenes. They're called the nutshell studies of unexplained death. They were used at that time to train detectives and police officers in their work. They're still used today. Frances Glessner Lee is now known as the mother of forensic science. So in the end, she got the career she wanted in police work, which is wonderful. And the dioramas themselves are, to me, amazing works of art, as is miniature art in itself, like to create real life in minuscule. And often because it's associated with, childhood toys and quiet feminine pursuits, it's often dismissed as an art form. It's been overlooked as an art form. And to me, for this film, it obviously was a tremendously inspiring art form, and her work in particular.
Wonderful. Any more questions? Oh, right here. Like with visuals? Do you mean like visually interesting?
Some ideas that you think, okay, this is a very boring section. What can I do to make it
Right. Well, like Jackie, you mentioned that there was some stuff that you cut out for the reason.
Yeah, if
of-
it's boring, just cut it
Yeah,
out.
it has to
Don't
be
keep
cut
it
out,
in.
yeah.
But no, it's a visual medium, so you must think of the visuals. And I often think of a visual approach before we even start filming. So there's the actual, when you're doing documentary, there's actuality footage. So there's consideration you want to give for that. What is the look of this actuality footage, when you're out following your documentary subject around? And then there's your B-roll. What is that going to be, and how is that going to look? So for Bernie Langille, a hugely important part of that film is how we decided to tell the reenactments, and we did that with miniature sets. So the concept for that actually came before we even found the story for Bernie Langille. And then, we considered things like Bernie's out in the world, and when he's out in the world interviewing people, those interviews themselves are actually kind of static. And yet we had this world of miniature sets, and those things are inanimate objects. So I knew when it came to filming the miniature sets that the camera always had to be moving. And luckily we were able to work with this long skinny lens called the probe lens, which enabled us to get a lot of movement into these, because when we did the short film, you'd have these tiny sets, you fit a big giant camera inside the tiny set to get a close-up of an even tinier thing. How you can move around was really quite hampered. By the time we went to do the feature, this probe lens had come out, and it changed everything, and we were able to have the camera be the movement in the world continually, and have the light, because we also worked with figures, doll figures, and they can't make expressions. So the light was extremely important because the light gave us the expressions for the doll figures.
And Brett, what about you with visuals? Did you think about the visuals of it when you were thinking about the story? I know that there's a lot of people speaking on camera, but other than the on-camera.
Yeah, I actually have probably the same length of time of a totally different visual exploration, which was a lot of, I don't know what you would call it, like shifting focus, and looking at land and animals and people interacting with those environments. Didn't go that way because of the pandemic, which is, I get tired of hearing that, but it's true. So when we began to kind of get the taped interviews in, it became more looking at that and seeing, okay, well, some of it's very lo-fi, So it's embracing that aesthetic of lo-fi, handheld. You know, you're there. Things aren't going to be perfect. And letting that kind of like just be the vibe of it, but then also making sure that there's no boring parts. And because I had a lot of footage, there were a lot of parts that were important but boring. And what can you do? You find ways to either bring that in through voiceover, like I've separate some of the voiceover, or get someone else to like speak about those parts in a more concise way. So there's a little bit of voiceover kind of at the beginning and the end. So there has to be consideration for that. Otherwise, I would have just slapped everything in a timeline, and we were watching like 3.5 hours of whatever came up. But yeah, there's a lot of shaping that happens. At least for me, it was more kind of I think you had come up with a miniature idea early on. So I was like the opposite. I was like, what am I going to do? And then figuring it out after we began to like get the footage and to edit it.
I was going to ask this earlier, but the people that are here in person, are there students here? Maybe raise your hand. So there's quite a few. Okay. Maybe we'll take more questions, or if we don't have questions, I can ask. Do we have questions? I was going to say, because I thought maybe there were some students here, do either of you have advice for people that maybe haven't made a film yet, or they're trying to kind of get their career off their ground? Jackie?
Do you want?
Brett?
I usually jokingly say run, but I feel like that's not particularly helpful. You're crazy, but I love you. It's a crazy thing to do to do this and to make films and to tell stories in this way. But I think there's something very fundamentally attractive, especially if you've decided to study this and to begin telling stories yourself. And I enjoy a wide variety of different genres and types of films and types of narratives. I think they're called bad films sometimes, but can a film really be bad? Yes, it can, but we won't talk about that.
Sometimes they're so bad they're good, and they're still entertaining, and that's all right.
It's like, you know, there's a line that you got to cross where it's so bad, but then there's another line behind it that becomes offensive. Anyway, don't do that. Just, you know, I would say something that someone told me. I don't even remember who told me this, but it's if you care about your story and you're passionate about telling your story, other people will pick up on that. If you don't care about your story and you don't love it, then people will also pick up on that. Unless you're very clever. So
That's pretty good advice. I used to say that about, I noticed that with bands. If you see a band playing and they're not even having fun, like the audience is like, why are we here? But if they're having fun, you're like, yeah.
I say go for it, even though a life in the arts is really impractical, and resign yourself to poverty. That doesn't get easier as you get older. It's still a great life. It's given my life a lot of meaning. It's saved my life time and time again. Also, I'm self-taught in a lot of my impractical careers. I'm self-taught in documentary. I started in radio documentary, and I was contributing for CBC, and they have no one, like basically someone shoved a Marantz in my hand, and then I went off and started recording sound and started putting it all together. So I'm never afraid of what I don't know. I'm always grateful to anybody who might tell me something I don't know. Also, you want to have high standards, but you don't want to be afraid of failing. And every opportunity you have to tell a story, you learn from, and you can basically go, what's the next story? And the next story will be better than the story that you have just told. And that will happen throughout your life. But yeah, go for it.
I'm not sure how we're doing for time. We've got a few more minutes. So we'll see, yes, if anyone has any more questions. Yeah, right here.
I guess for Brett, since this is your first documentary, can you talk about some of the stuff that you learned along the way, about the process, or even about yourself?
I learned that I'm not a documentary filmmaker.
That's not true.
No. I like to do things that I don't know and explore different mediums. And even in the mediums that I do work in, I'm getting to the point where I'm like, why is it a 3-act structure? And let's fail and figure out why it has to be. Or just like mess around with things, make a mess, make mistakes, and learn from them. And so when I set out to do this, and my partner, the Wabanagi Two-Spirit Alliance, kind of like coming on board, we talked a lot about just like what we were going to do. And there was a lot of talk, and then I just kind of like started doing stuff, and I didn't really have a plan, and that's not how I usually work at all. So it was more like intuitive, and then building a plan after realizing my intuition's not going to carry it all the way to the end. So, you know, that was kind of one of the things I learned about myself. I also learned and I can just like roll with stuff sometimes. It's not going to be how I pictured exactly in my head. It never is going to be that. But there's something that happens that brings you beyond that moment. And that happens for me in narrative film that comes out of collaboration. And in documentary, it's there as well. It's like a different shape. Maybe it's a Dimetrodon versus a T-Rex, I don't know. Just like, who knows? But it is there. So I was happy to find that magic still happens, and there's still a great enjoyment about the story. And you know, my ultimate conclusion was like, hey, I like this, I'd do it again.
That's what I wrote down when you were talking.
Oh, okay.
About Brett, will you make more documentaries? So yes, you will. Good. And Jackie, you said the next thing you're going to do is probably going to be a scripted fiction project.
Yeah. I mean, I started off in poetry, and then I had a 3 years writer's block, and I ended up writing a play, and then I ended up, that was my very blatant autobiographical play, and because it was a very blatant autobiographical play, I decided I would act it. And even though my actor friends were like, that's terrifying to get on stage, 3 years of writer's block had been more terrifying than getting on a stage. That led to me acting and writing in scripted television. And then I started doing, actually CBC hired me to do radio work. They thought I was a stand-up comic. I've never done stand-up comedy. And they wanted me to do funny little sketches. I started morphing those pieces into the kind of pieces that interested me, which was more like little mini documentary pieces. And then I started doing longer format radio documentary pieces, and that led to documentary film. And somewhere along the way in all of my impractical careers, I had a period where I worried that I wasn't being serious enough, that I wasn't committing to one area, one job, one area, and I was kind of flighty. And then it hit me one day that the consistent North Star in all of this is story, and that I serve story in the world of scripted and unscripted and different forms. And I'm good with that because story's my calling. So I even lost track of what we were talking about, except I blabbed on.
I think that was great. We were talking about kind of narrative and doc and different kind of forms of storytelling. So I think that this has been just a really interesting panel. I hope that you all enjoyed it very much today. I think we'll probably wrap it here. But Brett's film you can still see streaming as part of the festival in one of the shorts. Do you know what? Atlantic Shorts 1. You can't see
You can't see it at the
now.
Film Festival anymore, but it is going to the Lunenburg Doc Festival next weekend, so it will be there.
You
It
guys
will
wanna
be
go to
at
Lunenburg, you can
different
watch it there.
documentary festivals around the Maritimes this fall. At the end of November, it will be on the Documentary Channel, and sometime after that, it will be on CBC and CBC Gem.
Amazing. Okay, well, thank you both. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of the festival.